Hey everybody, let's get started and talk about NAFTA, which has recently become the USMCA. More on that a little bit. And so this is about free trade, so another global trade agreement. Okay, so we'll talk about, we'll give you a little bit of background, talk about the difference between NAFTA and USMCA, some pros and cons, a little bit about environmental and economic impacts, and some conclusions. Okay, so let's start with this and understand how important NAFTA is. And it's because it it includes the three of the top economic powerhouses in the world. So that would be the US, Canada, and Mexico, as you can see here. All right. So this is in terms of the largest trading partners that the United States has. Okay. Um, so these were gathered together to create benefit. So one of the key questions then is benefit to who? And I'd like to point out that, well, the primary benefit is to those who can make the most amount of profit. Um, but because that's what drives the economy. Okay, so here's a quick graphic that shows the three nations here and a little bit about the flow of money that goes between them. The flow of goods, really, just the value of the goods, not money in particular. And it also shows you the jobs that are supported. You can see here 2.2 million in Canada, 2.8 in the United States, and over 5 in Mexico. And you can see the dollar amounts here, 267 billion going to Canada, 278 coming from Canada into the US. The exports to Mexico are 231 billion, and imports from Mexico at 294 billion. Of course, these numbers will change because these numbers here are from a Standard & Poor's Financial Services report that was done in 2017. Okay, so let's talk about the timeline. So in 1981, President Reagan had proposed this North American Common Market. And then it's not until 1989 there's a free trade agreement, but even that didn't go far enough. There was more negotiations in 91 to liberalize trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Liberalize means basically removing many of the obstacles to trade, which is primarily tariffs. And then in 1992, there was an agreement in principle that was signed between H.W. Bush and the Canadian Prime Minister Mulroney and the Mexican President Salinas. And in 1993, everything came together with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that was signed into law by President Bill Clinton after some very difficult negotiations through Congress. So I think one of the things that helped make this happen, frankly, was because there was a Democrat in the White House and you had Republicans in the House. And so after you had two Republican presidents, you had a Democrat one, and then the thing was put together. The political stars all aligned, you might say. So the first day of NAFTA was on January 1st, 1994. And so it's an agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and it immediately eliminated tariffs on more than half of the U.S. imports that came from our imports to the U.S. from Mexico, and it also eliminated tariffs on more than a third of U.S. exports to Mexico. Okay, and it eliminates all tariffs within 10 years, except for some that are on agriculture, which we're going to take 5 more. And you know that's a difficult issue because one of the things, even though tariffs are removed, the United States provides over $300 billion in subsidies to the agriculture industry in the U.S., which makes the cost of U.S. agricultural exports cost less. So that makes it more difficult for other countries to compete with the United States when the U.S. agricultural imports have a $300 billion plus head start. So in 2008, was a renewal and of NAFTA with some new terms, And in 2014, there was a report about a 20-year assessment. And there's a nice little clip here from National Public Radio you might want to click on to see what is said about that. So more recently, the USMCA replaces NAFTA. So President Trump was running for office, and he was complaining about NAFTA and saying it was going to be replaced. So he essentially wanted it to have a new name, I think mostly for egotistical reasons, but nonetheless, it is now the USMCA, right? The USMCA. Let me fix that one thing there. There we go. So it's essentially NAFTA 2.0. So on November 30th of 2018, it was signed by Trump and the Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto and the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. There were a few minor revisions. And then, even though these presidents sign this stuff, it still has to go to legislative bodies to be ratified. So this shows you the importance of Congress, right? So, of course, in the United States, that means it has to go to the House of Representatives, and it has to go to the Senate and be approved by both of those bodies, and then go forward to the president, who would sign it again. So at any rate, all of that happened, and so it takes effect on July 1st, 2020. So what's different between these two things? Well, not a whole lot, really. There were some restrictions that were removed on the import of U.S. ultra-filtered milk that goes into Canada. U.S. dairy farmers have been hit hard, and so they were looking for things to improve their market. That was done. The automobile industry was affected, mostly because of about votes in areas where automobiles are manufactured, and so it was somewhat political here to appease to automobile workers. And so the agreement was that automobiles had to have 75% of their components that were made in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which was an increase of the previous requirements of 62.5%. By 2023, 40 to 45% of the components had to be made by North American workers making at least $16 an hour, which may not sound like much because we live here in the Silicon Valley, but it's a reasonable rate in other parts of the country. However, I'm thinking that here at San Jose State, when I hire students to work on projects, I pay them $17 an hour. So I don't think much of that $16 an hour. It doesn't seem like much of an incentive, but nonetheless, it's there. And another change was about copyrights. So the terms of copyrights was increased to 70 years after the life of an author, which was an increase of the limit of 50 years. Now, you might think that benefits an author, but typically these things are actually owned by corporations. So, for example, stuff that's owned by Disney is copyrighted, so that benefits Disney, not necessarily authors. Okay? All right, so other things that are different. There's a prohibition on duties for products like music or ebooks that are purchased electronically, because we didn't have those types of things in '94 when NAFTA was originally created. Other parts of NAFTA were scrapped. They were changed. That basically allowed investors to sue governments, so the governments didn't want that to happen anymore. There was a sunset clause, which basically says that the terms of the agreement expire after 16 years, and that every 6 years there would be a review, and then it could be extended after that. And I want to note here that House Democrats have been urging additions to the USMCA that would, among other things, strengthen labor laws and environmental protections. So largely that did not happen. So objectives of NAFTA and the USMCA are, just a second, please. Thank you for that. My dog was behaving badly, so I had to take care of that. So as I was saying about the objectives of the USMCA was to eliminate barriers, facilitate cross-border movement of goods and services. So that happened. Other objectives was to promote fair competition. That's debatable. To increase foreign direct investment. That means countries could invest in each other. That, to a large degree, has been happening. Providing more protection for intellectual property. This is extraordinarily important. And in NAFTA, on January, which began in January of 1994, eliminated all the tariffs over a period of 15 years. So that happened. And non-tariff barriers were replaced by some quotas. And these barriers were to be phased out over a 10 to 15 year period. And so all of that happened. So there were initial concerns about NAFTA, and it was really brought to light during this presidential debate when there was George H.W. Bush was running against Clinton, and there was a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who actually polled. He did exceptionally well in the election, and probably because he ran, he pulled votes away from H.W. Bush, and that's why we had Clinton as president. He won, I think, largely because Perot ran. At any rate, he said that there's going to be this great sucking sound in a televised debate, and that got a lot of attention because he was saying that that sucking sound was going to be jobs and industry that were going to be going to Mexico. He said there'd be this surge of imports and capital that would go to Mexico and destroy jobs in the U.S., that exports of agricultural products to Mexico would collapse Mexico's rural labor markets. Actually, he didn't say that, but there were others who were saying that. And there was also a concern that there'd be an increase in the number of unskilled workers from Mexico coming to the U.S. And then there's the issues of the plants, maquiladoras in Mexico, that there would be abuse of workers and the environment, a minimal or a lack of human rights protection, and there would be an increase in pollution. A lot of these things actually came true. More about that a little bit later. So there were environmental concerns. Sorry that there's so much stuff on this particular sheet here, but to get approval from Congress, the Clinton administration negotiated a side agreement on the environment, mostly to appease these Democrats, right? And so they created a Commission for Environmental Cooperation, or the CEC, and they created a framework for conducting analysis of NAFTA. And their initial hypothesis was that NAFTA would create an environmental race to the bottom among these three countries. And to some degree, that's what happened. But the CEC commissioned many papers, over 40, and they had lots of experts. So when I say commission, it means they basically have money, and then they hire a researcher to do a study, and then that study comes out. But then that study often just ends up as a paper and something to negotiate and debate about, but it doesn't actually result in any changes, right? So lots of words, lots of papers, little action. So another thing that came out from them was that, and this is kind of interesting, about that systemic threats to the North American environment were not proven, but that environmental threats in specific areas were proven. And that was basically because environmental policy or infrastructure or mechanisms were unprepared for this increasing scale of production through more trade. That's important because many of you may end up working in government and or industry, so it's important to understand how this affects certain areas. So one of the key questions that really comes out of the CEC is that with all this research being done, will any of this stuff be addressed in later negotiations? Well, they largely were not in the USMCA, and it looks like we're going to have to wait another 6 years before they will be. So one of the key things then is that, does NAFTA, the USMCA, does it cause U.S. job losses? And there's a lot of debate on this, and so I would just say probably. We know that it did in manufacturing, but manufacturing also lost a huge number of jobs due to automation. And another reason is that that with automation comes increased productivity. So there's a need for fewer workers. When you have a need for fewer workers, then there's fewer people that get hired. So what do we mean by this increased productivity? It comes from artificial intelligence and automation. So that would mean robots that are being used to assemble things, and plants that use much automation that replaces human labor to assemble products and to package products. So, and industry likes robots because robots don't get sick, they work faster, they don't complain, they don't join the union, and they don't get pay increases. So industry tends to like automation because it reduces their costs, which means it will improve or increase their profits. Okay, so a snapshot here about U.S. job loss in 2004 to 2009. This comes from Forbes magazine, and I have a link here if you want to look at that study or that research. So one of the key things that I want to point out about this is that there's a large number or amount of emotions that come from this topic of jobs, and Donald Trump used that to his advantage in pointing out how NAFTA, he says, killed millions of jobs. But it's really not that clear. But, of course, we know that he overstates pretty much everything from at least my perspective. Well, I think it's not just my perspective, it's just a fact. But we did have a loss of jobs in the U.S., about 2% of Americans from 2004 to 2009. And who's mostly at risk? Well, those workers that do not have college degrees. Those are the ones, mostly at risk. So finish your degree. The studies say that if you have a college degree, you'll make about $1 million more over your lifetime, which is enough to buy a house in Silicon Valley. So get your degree, go get those jobs. And so other things that happened about in this time period is that production was started to move overseas, so the benefit was that citizens enjoyed cheaper products, and large sectors of the workforce were lost their jobs, but the great majority of citizens actually end up with more goods at less price. And so as a result of this, the disenfranchised workers, they're rightfully angry, right? And they express it with their vote. And those are the votes that went to Trump, which more than likely put him over the top, even though he had 2 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. Thanks to the Electoral College, he got put in because he won states like Michigan, where there's the auto industry is. Okay, so this guy, David Autor, an MIT professor of economics, he calls this importing political polarization, saying that that's what's happening in the country, and that's still true today. So who benefits from all this stuff? Well, countries, people often say that this country or that country benefits. Well, that's much too general of a statement, I think, because it's really about the corporations that benefit, because they're the ones who are trying to derive profit from this. Countries benefit when they have workers that are employed, because of course that provides for stability. So primarily this is about increasing commerce. And did it increase commerce? Yes, absolutely. So does industry and companies, do they benefit? Yes, because more business means more sales, which means a potential increase in profit. And so that's the risk that they take, and then that's why they work towards these trade agreements. Do consumers win? Yes, because we have lower prices and we get greater variety of things. When you go to the grocery store and you find avocados and tomatoes, and you find many other agricultural products that are out of season, the reason why you can get them here is because of the trade agreement, because these things can still be grown in places like Mexico and be here in our grocery stores. In fact, most most people don't even realize what's in season and what's not in season because of globalization. So we can become even more ignorant as we have more globalization and more of these products brought in, and many of them are fresh vegetables from Mexico. So do the workers, or does the environment benefit? No, because when you have more consumption, there's more negative impacts. You know this from our talk about ecological footprints. But there's been you essentially have a conversion of natural resources. Sorry, let me fix that. Of natural resources that basically become products that ultimately end up in landfills. So we have more negative life cycle impacts. And because of NAFTA, there's actually more pollution in Mexico. More on that later. And do workers benefit? Well, no, not really, because weaker environmental regulations mean more negative impacts on workers, particularly those in Mexico. There's been job loss in the US and Canada. That's mostly due to automation. And then the other thought is that NAFTA helps drive down the cost of labor because of the competition from Mexico. So industry likes that, and labor unions in the US do not. Okay, so here's a little chart of NAFTA pros and cons that I got from this website called The Balance. And you can see that that trade increase, so that is up in jobs. There's 5 million more jobs in the US, but the US lost probably 682,000 manufacturing jobs. Of course, that will impact some states more than others. Wages were up a bit, but they are suppressed in factories. Immigration, that there's more Mexicans that are then moving into the United States. One of the reasons that happens is because there's a population increase. So we have to remember that as well, right? That population increase drives this. Environment, there's been impacts with environment. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so key takeaways at this point is that between the US, Canada, and Mexico, that NAFTA covered the largest area globally into and connected all of these three economies under a single trade agreement, a free trade agreement. And one of the positive aspects of NAFTA was the increased trade, economic output, foreign investment, and better consumer prices. So all those things happened. There was a cost of NAFTA with the loss of some U.S. jobs when domestic manufacturers then relocated to the lower wage Mexico. And as I said earlier, this also suppressed some of the wages in U.S. manufacturing plants. And then there's the other aspect about the exploitation of Mexico and Mexican workers. More on that in here. So let's do a quick 10-year analysis of NAFTA, and then we'll move on from there. So Mexico lost many farm jobs. And the reason why is because in the United States, we had a farm bill that subsidized U.S. agribusiness. So even though this says the 2002 Farm Bill, this comes up for renewal on a regular basis, and it has always been renewed. And so this is the $300+ billion that I'm talking about. So when NAFTA removed some of the trade tariffs, some of the companies then exported their corn and other grains to Mexico, which meant that rural Mexican farmers couldn't compete with the price from the United States, and so you had a lot of farmers going out of business, and then there were riots in Mexico because of this. It was a very significant impact to Mexico. At the same time, Mexico hurt itself by reducing its subsidies to farmers. And most of the subsidies that they did have went to the Mexico's larger farms, which then, of course, hurts the smaller farms. Okay, so a little bit about Mexico and the U.S. environment, that there was deterioration on both sides. Mexican agribusiness used more fertilizers and more chemicals that cost $36 billion a year in pollution management. Rural farmers expanded into marginal land because they're trying to produce foods. The marginal lands are lands that when used, can eventually collapse and not be able to support the crops that are on them, which then leads to things like soil erosion, water pollution from the soil getting into the water, and other marginal lands would be farmers moving into forests, and then that leading to deforestation. And the deforestation then loses habitat, removes habitat, and then reduces species, as well as the surgical removal of the lungs of the earth, which are the trees that are converting greenhouse gases back into oxygen. So deforestation being a key negative impact here. There's also been an increase in hazardous waste from Mexico that comes into the U.S. There's been untreated waste and ozone and sulfates that have increased on the border since NAFTA. Pesticides and toxic waste that are banned in the U.S. are then dumped into Mexico, meaning Mexico then uses these pesticides and toxics on things like agricultural products. And then these pesticides that are, when we use the word dump, what it means is that it's manufactured in the U.S. by companies and then exported to Mexico, then used on crops in Mexico since it's banned in the U.S., and then that comes back to the U.S., and then we consume those things. One of the other reasons that you see the increase in the consumer use of organic fruits and vegetables, because they know better and just choose to use something different. I know we do in my house. We buy organic when we can. So according to, let's talk about economics. According to Mexican national statistics, Mexico's poverty rate of 55.1% in 2014 was higher than the rate in 1994. So that means there were actually more people in poverty. Again, that could also be because of Mexico's extraordinarily high birth rates. And so you ended up having about 20.5 million more people in Mexico living below the poverty line. And we know that the problems of that, since we've already talked about this and did work on poverty in this course. And then you also see an increase in migrants from Mexico into the U.S. looking for opportunity. And yet the U.S. Congress has still not taken action to make it easier for Mexicans to come into the U.S. to work, particularly in the U.S. agricultural industry, where they are needed. They are extraordinarily important to the agricultural industry in the United States, and the U.S. Congress needs to act to allow that to happen. And then you have wage decrease in Mexico as well. So let's talk a bit about maquiladoras. These are the factories that are on the border of the U.S. And there's concern that these workers have been exploited. So there's more of these maquiladoras because of the tariffs being removed because of NAFTA. And for much less cost than workers in these maquiladoras can assemble products for export back into the U.S. And that program grew to employ about 30% of Mexico's labor force. These workers have no labor rights and no health protections, according to this organization, Continental Social Alliance, and I've read that in many other sources as well. So And then there's this other concern that work days are much longer. They don't get overtime pay like we do in the United States. If you work more than 8 hours a day or more than 40 hours a week, you get overtime. That's not the case in here. And if you're a woman, you could be forced to take a pregnancy test, meaning that if you're pregnant, then you're not going to get the job. So here's a diagram that shows how maquiladoras are, how the process works. Basically, you have the import of materials that come into Mexico from places like the United States, where they are then transformed into goods from assembly, and then they're coming back to the U.S., and then they come to the final customer, which would be us. So here in the U.S., we get to enjoy lower cost goods because of this. Okay, so companies like this, again, why? Because it reduces their cost and then increases their potential for profit. Okay, so a couple of images of maquiladora plants in Mexico. So a little snapshot here of economics. So the total trade between these NAFTA partners has more than doubled from 1994 to 2004. So in 10 years, in this 10-year period, we had an additional over $350 billion, right, in increased trade. And then you have more jobs that are being supported. The American economy grew during this period. The U.S. enjoys a higher standard of living because we pay less for these products. Productivity increases. There's impact on jobs and wages in the U.S., but probably not a whole lot. But nonetheless, there was an expectation that it would that pressure from the low cost of labor in Mexico would help keep labor costs down in the U.S. So there are all these factors that are moving around here. So in the U.S., there's this concern about with the environment that there's severe air pollution and ozone depletion from these maquiladora plants and vehicle emissions. So you have trucks coming from Mexico into the United States. And then these trucks also not meeting U.S. safety standards, which has been a significant area of argumentation between the countries. Water pollution is a very significant problem. There's actually you have raw sewage being dumped into the Pacific that then comes up into the San Diego area, and there's very little wastewater that is properly treated, and improper treatment of toxic waste and chemicals. So these things, of course, are linked to cancers, birth defects, lupus, things like that. And the major cause of this toxic waste and chemicals and water pollution are the maquiladoras. So what about Canada? The economic effects in Canada is that there's been 2.3 million jobs were created in Canada. Again, we're looking at a 10-year snapshot. So that is a 17.5% increase over pre-NAFTA employment levels. Canada's exports account for about 40% of the GDP of the country. So that's important to Canada. Canada makes more money, right? Trade in between Canada and the U.S. now is about $2 billion a day. So Canada is our largest trading partner, so that helps both of these countries. And exports from Canada to Mexico have more than doubled, and imports of Mexican products to Canada have tripled. So this has also been very beneficial to Mexico, more products going to buyers. Okay, so how can we improve NAFTA 2.0 or this the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement, right? The USMCA. Well, it can be improved by strengthening environmental protections, giving the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, meaning that would be the CEC that we discussed earlier, and give them greater power to prosecute violators of environmental laws such as air and water pollution. Put some teeth into this thing And second is to allow for local governments, and even the private sector to address these pollution problems, because they're not being addressed on the federal level between these three nations. The next is to strengthen worker protection. So that would mean endorsing fair trade instead of free trade. So we'll be talking about fair trade coming up soon. It essentially means internalizing the externalities of production so that you would then reduce negative impacts to the environment and to people. And if there's an increase in the cost of the product, so be it. We will then pay that cost so that workers will get a fair wage, and that pollution isn't then put out into the environment, which of course pollutes all of us, okay? And the other aspect about this is requiring these companies to take into account this human cost of poverty, and for the companies to improve working conditions, wages, and the environment. Because when they do so, they then take the pressure off governments, right, to provide welfare and other benefits to the public, right? And if the government is to provide those things, they have to have revenue to do it. So it makes much more sense for the companies to internalize their externalities. They should pay for the cost that of the problems that they create. So in conclusion here, NAFTA has contributed to huge economic growth to member nations. It increased trade between and the gross domestic product of each of the countries. North America region is ranked the world's fastest growing economic region in the world. There's been minimal job loss, but that is hotly debated, and I have a link here in case you want to look at something here about the jobs. Trump has made the argument that we've lost, millions of jobs, and of course he overstates that. There has been a loss of jobs, but it's again, it's in certain sectors, mostly manufacturing, and some of that was addressed with the increase of production of automobile parts in the U.S. Okay, and then another part of the conclusions here is that the maquiladora plants have had severe effects on the environment, meaning air and water pollution that is on both sides of the border of the U.S.-Mexican border. There's been an increase in poverty in Mexico and an increase of human rights abuse, and there's a need to improve all those things. So it's important to recognize what the problems are so that those things can be addressed in further negotiations. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks much, and have a great day.